Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Denis Shackel as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Denis Shackel is Professor Emeritus of Management Communications at Ivey Business School, Western University, Canada. Professor Denis is an award-winning educator, psychologist, and leadership consultant whose career spans classrooms, universities, and boardrooms across the globe. He began as an elementary school teacher in New Zealand while completing BA Diploma of Teaching, Diploma of Education, and MA First Class Honours. He later earned a PhD in school psychology from the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, now it's called University of Toronto, where he taught educational psychology from 1971 to 2000. Recognized for exceptional impact in the classroom, Professor Denis was named Professor of the Year upon his retirement from Ontario Institute for Studies in Education in 2000, before relocating to London. He went on to teach at Ivey Business School, where he received the highest University of Western Ontario Teaching Award after his first year in 2004, and earned the same honor again in 2010. In July 2007, the Ontario Ministry of Training, Colleges and Universities selected Professor Denis as a leader in faculty teaching, reflecting his sustained influence on teaching excellence. Beyond academia, Dr. Denis has served as a president of his management consulting firm, Unlocking of Talents, since 1978. He has delivered leadership and development programs for managers in business, industry, and government worldwide. The Canadian Management Center and the American Management Association have described him as a creative, courageous, and energetic visionary who radiates a positive professional presence with confidence and humility. A true world-class educator. In 2010, he was also profiled in the National Post in MPBT's feature, Lateral Living, Denis Shuns the Downs Days. Dr. Denis is the author of award-winning Canadian bestseller 5 Seconds at a Time. Today, he focuses on designing and delivering custom development courses for organizations across North America and internationally, including Maple Leaf Foods, JD Irving Limited, KPMG, The Learning Edge, Etratech Incorporation, the American Management Association, and the Silvic Group of Companies. He is also lead executive retreats and strategic planning sessions for a wide range of organizations, including Bell Canada, Petro Canada, Deloitte, Burger King, IMAX, Bombardier, RBC, and numerous public sector and industry bodies. In today's episode, Professor Denis discusses key insights from his acclaimed book, 5 Seconds at a Time, How Leaders Can Make the Impossible Possible. It's a pleasure to have him with us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Denis Shackel. Professor Denis, thank you for joining us. It's a true honor to have you on the Business Talk today.
Oh, Deepak, it's a pleasure, privilege, and as Obama used to say with a lot of his speeches, nay, a blessing to be with you on this day.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Shackel, you describe a single second you will never forget. When your brother-in-law, Bruce, reached out his hand during his fall on Mount Ruapehu and then pulled it back, choosing to save your life instead his own. The act of selflessness became a recurring theme in the book. How did that 1 second reshape the way you think about leadership and the choices leaders make under extreme pressure?
That 1 second was priceless and was a mountaintop experience for me. In preparation for our conversation, Deepak, I did a quick calculation. I took the years of my life that I've been alive, multiplied that by 365, then multiplied that by 24, multiplied that by 60 and by 60, and you can probably guess what I was doing. I was calculating the approximate seconds I've lived in my life. And I remember the first three digits were 299 and there was a 543 and I've forgotten the last three digits, but the point is that it came very close to 3,000 million seconds I've lived in my life. And out of that 3,000 million, the 1 second that screams at me as being truly profound was, as you described, when my brother-in-law, with whom I was climbing this mountain, his crampons, the spikes on the boot broke, and he was a little higher than I was. And as he started a slide slightly to my left that was unbelievably fast, his crampons broke and he started feet first rocketing towards me. We had brief eye contact, and he definitely saw me stick my left hand out to catch him because he stuck out his left hand. And Deepak, when our hands got approximately a yard apart, when he suddenly pulled his hand back and refused to accept my hand, we both knew what was going to happen there. He was 6'3", 230 pounds, big guy, and the amazing speed with which he rocketed towards me, there was no doubt that had he taken my hand, I wouldn't have the pleasure of talking with you today. I couldn't have held him. I wasn't anchored. We weren't roped. It's a bit controversial issue with climbers, but fortunately, that day anyway, neither of us were roped to anything or each other. So when he pulled his hand back, it was because he realized that he would take me with him. Not that he was predicting he was plummeting to his death, but it was a frightening, fear-filled crisis. When he pulled his hand back, I'll never forget that he, instead of just continuing the projectile, he rolled over and used his ice axe absolutely correctly. There's a certain technique that you hold the metal top with one hand and the handle with the other. And if you do it correctly, you use the weight of your upper body on the handle of the axe to stick the spike into the snow. And in normal circumstances, that would stop anybody who does it correctly. I saw Bruce before he disappeared behind some rocks a bit lower than where I was standing. I saw him do it absolutely correctly. He had strength and skill to operate the axe in a way that he should have stopped, and he should theoretically be alive today. But unfortunately, 17th of May, it was a week when the weather was rather unusual. It was unusually hot during the day and unusually cold during the evening. And when there's a big range of temperature, I'm not sure if you're aware, most climbers are, that it turns ice into what is often called boilerplate. It's like steel. And even with his strength, his accuracy, his skill, and correctness of attempts to stop himself, he couldn't get the spike into the ice. So visually, it's a second that I'll always remember. And auditorily, because there was a scratching of the spike on the ice that a bit like nails on a blackboard. I'll never forget that point or that added component to the second in my life that I'll treasure and remember for the rest of my life was profound. And did you mind repeating the part of the question? I may have wandered off from your topic. Do you mind? Have I answered that first question sufficiently?
Yes, yes, Professor.
Okay. Uh,
Yeah. So let me jump to the second one. Stranded alone at -30 degrees Celsius, dress only in shorts and t-shirt. You choose to break the night into 5,000 5 seconds intervals and deal with just one at a time. What was happening in your mind during those five few intervals? Was it a conscious, rational decision, or did it emerge instinctively from your years of studying and teaching leadership?
Good question. I appreciate it a lot. As I've reflected on that, Deepak, I can identify that it was partially conscious. And partly as a result of my thinking about and presenting workshops for many years. So you asked if it was conscious. Yes. Was it a rational decision? It wasn't so much a cognitive rational decision so much as an intuitive gut sense of having thought about these issues a lot in my life, and I'm convinced that there is a spiritual component in leadership in life that most people do recognize. I certainly do, and as you kindly said in your letter, you acknowledge that I am a man of faith. So I have a sense of God's existence. Interestingly, I read just a few weeks ago in an article on atheists who don't believe there is a God or know nothing higher power. Apparently, 97% of atheists pray on their deathbed, which stuck in my head because that's interesting. Even people who say, oh, the spiritual component is non-existence, or I choose to ignore it, or irrelevant, or dismiss it, still there must be an intuitive, universal gut sense for most people, regardless of their actual religion, that acknowledges there is a spiritual component. As one of the thoughts that has occurred to me over the years is that a leader rather, is a custodian of the human spirit. And so the question of how and why did I break it down into 5 seconds at a time? It was a conviction that I think there is a spiritual component. God was with me in that moment. And as I implemented pretty automatically, instinctively from previous thought and experience to say, well, what are we going to do here? I'm convinced that the whole principle of breaking a task that appears difficult down into smaller steps is universally practical and useful, life-changing. And so in that moment of crisis, time of crisis, it came fairly instinctively, and I was aware of choosing to picture in my head the vision of seeing the rising sun. That was what I chose, and that, I suppose you could say it was a cognitive decision. But it occurred to me in this time of crisis, gosh, what am I going to do here? Well, I instinctively chose, and I think my higher power was speaking to me and saying, not only do I stay with you, and I think of myself as a child of God. So God was speaking to me and said, okay, look, I'm not only with you, but nothing can separate you from my love for you. And that all instinctively led to my choosing to picture seeing the rising sun. And I am aware I am more visual than auditory or kinesthetic. And perhaps, are you familiar with the neuro-linguistic programming model? So most people tend to have a dominance in either being visual, auditory, or kinesthetic. I think from memory is something like 58% of visual people, or people are visual. I am. And so the idea of having a vision, even the word vision is pictorial, choosing to picture in my head the expectation to see the rising sun seemed a logical and wise decision that fitted my thinking and my processing information. And the expectation of seeing that boosted up my faith that I would actually experience seeing the morning. It was obviously fearful and probable, possible in that crisis that, like Bruce, I was going to die. So faced with death, it makes life and living a little clearer when there's the pressure of that sort of crisis. And I have a concern I may be waffling here or rambling, but it was all an application of what I'm increasingly convinced is accurate to first step facing a crisis is, in fact, ironically, to step back in order to move forward. Step back in reflection and listen to the still quiet voice that I think we all have access to, regardless of our particular faith. I hear what I choose to think of as God speaking to me in undeniable ways. And so I know it's very personal and not everybody would agree with my bias, but I'm convinced God exists. He's with me. He loves me. And so I was listening to his input in my thoughts. And it's a part of the reason why I'm personally convinced that leadership is best thought of as a thought choice. It's more of a disposition than a position, more of a thought choice than a title. Just because you're the CEO or a professor doesn't mean that you're a leader necessarily. You're a leader only if you have followers. and whether you like it or not, I'm personally convinced that people with whom you're privileged to work and serve as a leader will be listening carefully to you and inwardly decide whether they trust you, give you credibility or not. Every time we speak, I think we audition for leadership. It's one of my favorite lines. I'll just repeat that if I may. Every time we speak, we audition for leadership. And so a lot of the classes that I'm still missing somewhat that I enjoyed at Ivey involved public speaking and how to present high impact or present with high impact in order to persuade and influence other people. So the speaking is particularly important, and I'm prompted to go back to the beginning of your question, or first question, about the significance of that 1 second. Bruce's act of pulling his hand back screamed at me and still screams at me because I'm convinced that nobody really cares how much you know until they know you care. And that act, his behavior of pulling his hand back, was such a powerful, profound action that screamed much more than any words. Even, what's his name, Mark Paston, he's an authority in ethics, said, ignore what they say about ethics, watch what they do. And so it wasn't what Bruce was saying, but in that action of pulling his hand back, what he did, he showed his caring in a way that is, well, if I may add a personal component here, somebody at his funeral, I'll never forget, the speaker said that Bruce was the most Christ-like person that they'd ever met. And it was a reference to the Christian perspective of Christ choosing death in order to grant us eternal life. And I know that's not everybody's philosophy, that is mine. This is what I was brought up with, and I think and act and live minute by minute with that conviction that Christ is the center of my faith, and on that it gives me confidence and assurance of purpose for whatever I happen to be doing, including talking with you too.
Professor, in your TEDx talk, you distilled the survival experience into three core leadership lessons: the power of vision, the importance of correction, and the absolute pinnacle of selflessness.
Yeah.
Could you walk our listeners through how each of these three principles operates in a corporate boardroom, not just on a mountainside?
Yeah. Well, we've already touched on vision, and I'm convinced that that saved my life and something that all leaders must have. I have found it in my experience rather disturbing that many times I've been privileged to have workshops with executives whom, if I just put them on the spot and say, so what's the vision statement of your organization? It is something which, when I put somebody on the spot like that, it's disturbing that majority of times there's no immediate clear answer. And I'm convinced that clarity leads to power. And even executives I've had the privilege of working with cannot always say, well, the vision statement is this, 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 and this. Often I found it rather funny to say, oh, well, it's on the boss's office. It's got a gold frame around it. It's a statement on his wall or her wall. That's losing its impact. It should be something that is punchy, immediately at your fingertips, and a sense of the desired future state. And that's the way I like to think of the vision. So vision again. It's not just Solomon, who is regarded as perhaps one of the wisest people in history. In Proverbs, it's written that where there is no vision, people perish. And I remember that quote because I'm absolutely sure I would have perished had I not chosen to focus on the vision of seeing the rising sun. And so that was the first of the three. Um, Forgive me. What was the second one you asked?
The importance of correction.
Oh, yes, indeed. Um, if I may, Deepak, what's the significance, or does this date have significance for you? Is the 20th of July, 1969, does that ring a bell with anything in history that is of significance? Do you know the significance of that date?
Not exactly, Professor.
All right. Well, let me explain. That's when Neil Armstrong stepped out of the module on the moon, and some people may disagree it ever happened, but I I remember it was the 20th of July, 1969, because I happened still to be in New Zealand teaching elementary grade, and the principal of the school, I'll never forget, on the 20th. Well, let me make a little correction. I remember that date because I was in New Zealand on that at the time of that event, which New Zealanders are a day ahead of North American because it was obviously NASA with the North American rocket had accomplished landing on the moon, but I think it was the 21st of July. And that sticks in my head because the date then at that time was the 21st of July, and it happened to be my sister's birthday, and my sister with whom I'm really close was obviously the wife of Bruce who died. But what I'm leading up to is many people will know that date or certainly be aware of what did Neil say? One small step for man, a giant leap for mankind, or words to that effect. But what NASA has reported and what screams at me as so important about that historic event was the percent of time that NASA has reported the rocket that took the astronauts to the moon, the percent of time that it was exactly on track as planned, as they had predicted. And are you familiar or do you remember? I think I put it in the book. Do you remember the number? Well, let me remind you anyway that what NASA has reported was that most of the time, 97% of the time, the rocket, when it was shooting up through space in the objective of landing on the moon, which was NASA's vision, the majority of the time it was just a little bit off track. And had the people down on Earth monitoring the progress, had they not been able with their sophisticated computers to make a correction, the rocket would never have landed successfully. And it was the act of correcting the path on that journey that was identified as the key reason why they made history and were the first to land on the moon. And it's an analogy that screams at me as one that fits not just with my personal life, because much of the time I'm a little bit off track. I need constant correction. As a kid, I remember having to take military training in high school, and there was an expression: "Get ready, aim, fire." What I have found with my experience, particularly at Ivey, is rather than get ready, aim, fire, is better to fire or aim, fire, and then be ready to correct once you've acted. So the necessity to be flexible and adaptable is a huge lesson that I got from that night at the top of the mountain. So the vision was established. I remembered I needed to be flexible. I'm personally convinced that the future belongs not to the super strong or necessarily the super smart, but the super adaptable. Whether we like it or not, it's difficult to predict change that is going to hit us, whether we like it or not, and the absolute need to be ready and prepared to make a little correction in our speech, our decision, or the process of however we're solving problems that are on our desk, on our screen, on our life. So adaptability was that second key. And what did we identify as the third, Deepak?
Yeah,
Vision.
absolute pinnacle of selflessness.
Oh, yes, that's right. Thank you. Yeah, the pinnacle of selflessness. Bruce's decision to put his life second to mine was an example, dramatic, the ultimate action showing service that screams out the importance that leaders, effective leaders, must have a passionate, caring, or even I'm prepared to call it love for their clients, the people whom they're privileged to work with. That means putting them, the client, ahead of themselves and having a passionate commitment to serving them. And so service, it would be that third component that I would argue my mountain story stressed. I had a sense of that before the experience of that mountain tragedy, but the tragedy certainly reiterated the importance. So, as I think you've probably seen in the text, I'm convinced that leadership is primarily a state of mind rather than a title, and to have the state of mind that recognizes our job as a leader is to be of service is what you call that ultimate selflessness. Nobody likes arrogance or conceit, and in fact, because we acknowledge my New Zealand background, the mountain that is the tallest one in New Zealand is Mount Cook. Have you been to New Zealand, Deepak?
No,
No.
no, Professor.
I'd encourage you. The tallest mountain, and the Maoris call it Arangi. That's their Maori word for that mountain, which, when translated, means cloud piercer. So Mount Cook is the tallest one, and Bruce and I originally were planning to climb that, partly because we discovered that we both shared not only a passion for climbing, but Sir Edmund Hillary, who many people will know the name, the first person to climb Everest. Not that many people recognize that he was also a Kiwi, a New Zealander. He was a beekeeper and a sheep farmer, but he lived close to Mount Cook, and he practiced on Mount Cook before he went off to the Himalayas and made history in 1953 by climbing the tallest mountain in the world. All of that background made it a significant plan for Bruce and me to climb Mount Cook together. We went one day down, it's in the South Island, not the North. We did go together to check it out, but discovered it was very difficult. And I'll never forget the fact that that was our plan to climb the Cook because it's the tallest one. And the name of the school that I first taught in elementary grades was Arangi. And every morning when I go through the front door of the school, there was a big picture of Mount Cook on the wall of the office that reminded me of Mount Cook. And one of my heroes is Sir Edmund Hillary. And it's a long-winded way, Deepak, of going back to the point that we were making. Nobody likes having a leader that is conceited or not, selfless. Sir Edmund Hillary, I had the privilege of meeting him before he died. And as well as being a remarkably tall man, he was 6'7", he was perhaps one of the most humble people I'd ever met in my life. And he comes to my mind as a good example of an inspirational leader because of his humility, which the word humble with the Greek root of humility means power with restraint. And like everybody, all leaders are potentially very powerful, but if that escalates to a selfishness, not a selflessness, then it'll come across as being arrogant and conceited, and nobody likes that at all. So that's why the humility is so basic as a key characteristic, I think, for any leader to be effective. So,
Professor, you write about Blaze Impulse, a moment when intuition told you to climb up the mountain rather than continuing downward to search for Bruce. That decision likely saved your life. In the business world, leaders are often taught to rely on data and analysis. How do you
mhm.
teach executives to develop and trust their intuition? And when should instinct override the spreadsheets?
The first thought that comes to my mind is that my story, and it's really why I wrote the book, my story, I think, illustrates the how do I teach leaders. The story has gained awards partly because of people learning from the story itself. How do you teach it? My simply sharing the life-changing story seems to be a partial answer to that, and a readiness to display my vulnerability, which not everybody would agree with, is, I think personally, is a key characteristic of a leader. And so the act of sharing the story and writing about it, being prepared to talk honestly and talk of spiritual matters, isn't that common. And I have found invariably when I run that risk, then it pays off with the response from the audience and readers, period.
Professor, one of the key takeaway from your Site Canada presentation was that leading from inside is what separates exceptional leaders from mediocre ones. You have spent decades teaching psychology before pivoting to management communications. How does your background in psychology inform this idea that leadership is fundamentally an inside-out process?
By recognizing the importance of whether you call it a small, still, quiet voice inside, or intuition, by recognizing that problem solving is not only cognitive decision making, but the necessity to listen to what I've referred a lot to what I simply regard as the Holy Spirit, God's dwelling within me, but listen to others. And sadly, I have found that the majority of even so-called leaders fall into a trap and listen in order to reply rather than to understand. So having a mental set of putting a lot of effort and priority into listening to understand before being understood is recognized by people like Stephen Covey and even prophets. But I think it has a very important practical aspect that I have found in my career leaders will respond to positively and tend to agree that, okay, it's important to, even if it's just in the name of selflessness, to pay close attention to the clients or the followers' ideas and to give priority to seeking to understand before you attempt to persuade somebody else that your opinion may be better than his or hers.
Professor, your leadership presentations emphasize a concept about prioritizing the biggest priorities first. putting the big rocks in the jar before filling in the sand and water. Many leaders today are overwhelmed by an evolving of tasks, small tasks. What practical advice from the book would you give to a leader who knows their big rocks but still can't stop drawing in the gravel?
Perhaps it's appropriate for me to tell another true story of an experience in one of my first years teaching at Ivey. It was a course that was optional, and so there were only 15 students in this particular class, and a day will stay with me all my life, involved my getting to the classroom before the students and placing on their desks a rock, or it was really just a small big stone. But when they came in, we greeted each other, and when we started, I had a jar sitting on the desk up front and simply asked them to take the rock that I'd put on their desk, come up and put it into the container, into the jar. And there were 15 students in the class, and they all came up and tried to put their rock into the jar. But I had calculated it correctly because I had hoped that the 15 students, some of them wouldn't be able to put it in the jar just because the jar held only about 12 rocks. And sure enough, there were three students who didn't exactly complain too much. But when I said to them, well, what are you doing this for? What story am I attempting to illustrate? I simply asked them, is the jar full? And because it is, said everybody. In fact, three people said, I can't even put mine in. Definitely it's full. Well, what's the lesson here? And that's when, as you referred to the gravel, I pulled out from underneath the desk another container with small gravel and was able to pour it into the jar, and the gravel went in amongst all the rocks. And they smiled and thought, oh, yeah, okay, so what? And they were MBA students who have a reputation of enjoying drinking a lot of beer. And so I also had a bottle of a beer and could also pour it in. So on top of the rocks, I could get the gravel in, even after they said, of course, the jar's full. Well, I added even more gravel and then the liquid and attempted then to get a point across by saying, well, so what? And I'll never forget one of the first student who came up with the answer was, it just shows us that even when your schedule is very full, there's always room to put some extra stuff in it. No, that was the whole point of it. Come on, you'll kill yourself. And what we all concluded was that unless you put the big rocks in first, you'll never be able to get them into life, into your container. So it was a graphic way of illustrating the importance of prioritizing, keep focusing on what's really important, and stick to that. Otherwise, you'll never be able to fill the jar or complete the task or overcome the challenging projects that we all have. So prioritizing and monitoring your behavior to make sure you keep them priority. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And it's so easy to lose track of that. Even when people will say, oh, family is the important thing for me. Well, that's not always the behavior of men and women. The percentage of violence within families suggests that families aren't always that easy and as important as we speak about. It's what we're doing that is really much more important, and what clients will be watching, or potential followers will be watching what we're doing rather than what we're saying.
Professor, on that mountain, you describe hearing the words, I can do all things through Christ who strengthened me. And then
Mm-hmm.
finding Gideon Bible inside the hut with that very verse highlighted.
Mm-hmm.
Faith plays a significant role in your story. For
Mm-hmm.
leaders who may not share a religious orientation, how do you translate that experience into a universal principle about meaning, purpose, and resilience?
Mm-hmm. A very good question, because I yes, have a personal faith that is close to my heart, and I dive with my own personal convictions. But my job as a leader is not to convert the rest of the world. Other people have different models, different religious beliefs, and my job is not to be critical of them. I'm certain about my own, but to be able to encourage people with different viewpoints, religious viewpoints, to show them still I respect alternative models without attempting to say that they're wrong. To drop judgment of people with different ideas is really particularly important to me personally. And if I may, the very first year of my teaching back in New Zealand with elementary grades, the practice in New Zealand was for teachers to be evaluated through inspectors coming to sit in your class and judge you. And the very first inspector that came into my classroom, his name was Joshua Weinstein. Are we still in touch?
Yes, yes, Professor. Please go ahead.
All right. You've disappeared, but if you can hear me, I'll just finish the
Yes, I can
story.
hear you. I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Okay. Um, Joshua Weinstein, a fine Jewish gentleman, uh, wrote on my workbook what I will never forget. His words to me were, look, in the teaching career, and if you're going to be a leader of any sort in the field of education, walk the path in which you have faith. That was his wording. Because over lunch we were chatting informally, and we recognized that his belief system as a Jew was different from mine. He did not recognize, as I did or do, the significance of Christ. But he had what I think was the wisdom to say, well, that's okay. Walk the path in which you have faith, and you'll do well. And so I've hung on to that wisdom and believe that just because, well, I'll go back with the Jewish people, there's deep respect for Jewish people. They may think differently than I spiritually, but it's certainly not going to surprise me if, when my turn comes to get to the pearly gates and then to heaven, it's not going to surprise me if there are a lot of Jewish people there too, because they have in fact lived and taught and led according to what they personally believe is truth. And faith is the act of being true to your own faith that is a key determinant. The words that you quoted was part of my story, and I was amazed to hear them. Well, can I add a little bit more here, Deepak?
Sure, Professor. I would like to conclude this episode with one last question.
All right.
You wrote this book in 2010, yet the book's message feels more urgent today. Leaders are navigating AI disruption, geopolitical uncertainty, and post-pandemic fatigue. If you were stranded on that mountain today, metaphorically speaking, facing the complexity of modern leadership, what would you add to the toolkit you offered readers 15 years ago?
I would add, and I really appreciated your sharing that question with me, Deepak, because you may or may not know there is a sequel to the book. I've written a second one as a consequence of the first, since writing 5 seconds at a time. And it's all to do with the importance for a leader or for any person to deal with difficult conversations. And as with 5 seconds at a time, chapter one in that book was the true story of Bruce and me climbing the mountain and his plummeting to his death. Well, I start the second book, which is a consequence of my work on the first one, because I start the second book with a true story in its chapter one. The fact was that it was my idea for Bruce and me to climb the mountain. And when I was picked up by a helicopter and taken to hospital the next morning, having got through the night, because Bruce and I did not turn up at the 5 o'clock meeting point, I knew that my sister would sound the alarm, and that's why I was confident during the night, even if I was facing death, that she would sound the alarm, and hanging on to the vision of waiting for the rising sun, confident that I would see it, was all because I was equally confident that when we didn't turn up at the pickup point that Bruce and Kathleen, my sister, and I all had agreed on, I knew she would sound the alarm, and so I had anticipated that somebody would be out looking for me in the morning, and that's exactly why I was picked up by the helicopter. So I'm thankful for my sister sending the rescuers out, but I was very fearful of my sister's response to me when she heard that her husband had died. It was my idea to climb the mountain. I was afraid that she wouldn't even want to talk with me, let alone have a relationship in the future, and she'd blame me. At least that's what I had thought. So I'll never forget that after the rescue helicopter scooped me up, they actually landed on the other side of the mountain where I was told my sister was waiting for me. And that conversation with her was the most difficult conversation I've ever had in my entire life, because I was afraid she'd be furious at me and maybe not want to have anything to do with me in the future, and would predictably blame me. And so the topic of difficult conversations has become more recently a crucial one. When I was in my last year at Ivey, I was privileged and blessed to be able to use the alumni. And so I tapped into the commitment from about 10,000 people who were graduates of the school, business leaders around the world, and a quick questionnaire that I was able to forward to them through the alumni. I got responses from 7,000 leaders, business leaders, who answered my questions, and I have hard data to show that out of the big sample of people who are faced with a difficult conversation, And we're all faced with them. And I defined a difficult conversation as one where there was significant differences of opinion, is emotionally charged, and the stakes are high. And we all have them in personal and professional life. Well, I asked them to answer certain questions, and the data I collected showed that just about 50, it was 49%, but just about half of the sample chose to avoid a difficult conversation if and when they're faced with it. And out of the half who did have the courage to confront somebody with whom they were having a difficult time, or maybe the other person is bullying them, or for some reason there's an issue that needs to be dealt with, the half who did have the courage to confront and attempt to deal with it, the vast majority of them failed to listen accurately, failed to distinguish assertiveness from aggression, and invariably came up with saying, yeah, sure, I've got the guts to be brutally honest. And I'm convinced the older I get that there's no place for brutality in any relationship, whether it's personal or professional. So out of the half of my big sample who answered the questions that, yes, I won't avoid, I will confront somebody with whom I have strong differences of opinion, vast majority of them messed it up and ended up failing to come to a mutually satisfying agreement. And so the data I collected since writing 5 seconds at a time on this topic of difficult conversations showed that only 3% of this large sample of business leaders, A, did have the courage to confront, and B, could do it successfully and end up with big issues, emotionally charged issues being sorted out and dealt with successfully. So the more up-to-date edition, I'm delighted to attempt to persuade any reader, any person that's interested, is important. Since writing 5 seconds at a time, I've called it Caring Enough to Confront. That's the title. It's self-published, and it hasn't taken off quite as in a big fashion as I was hoping and anticipating, but I have become today, since writing the first book, passionately concerned because I'm convinced that a difficult conversation avoided is a difficult conversation amplified. So unless we can have the courage to confront somebody who's giving us a hard time or we're having difficulty with, unless we can do it with enough caring, call it love if you like, and genuine listening in order to understand before being understood, then leaders are not going to be as effective as they could, because all leaders do have and will have difficult conversations. And I'm hoping that the content in this second book is helpful in future leaders being able to deal with what I'm convinced is a very important issue for any leader.
Thank you, Professor Denis Shackel, for joining us today and sharing your time, insights, and experience so generously. Your reflection on leadership, resilience, and the discipline of handling big challenges, 5 seconds at a time, gave us not only a compelling story, but also practice principles we can take straight into our work and lives. What stood out throughout this conversation was your emphasis on clarity of vision, the courage to course correct, and the power of selflessness. Ideas that feel especially relevant in a world where so many leaders are carrying constant pressure and uncertainty. You have reminded us that progress doesn't always come from dramatic breakthroughs. It often comes from choosing the right next step, even when the path feels overwhelming. On behalf of our listeners, Business Talk, thank you again for the learning, the inspiration, and the perspective. Professor Denny, it's been a privilege to host you. Wishing you continued success with your teaching, writing, leadership work. Thank you once again.
Oh, thank you very much, Deepak. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.